The year was 5001, and Rome pulsed like the beating heart of Christendom. Pilgrims from across Europe poured into the eternal city, their sandals worn from long journeys, their voices raised in hymns that echoed against marble walls older than memory itself. Incense drifted from churches, bells tolled across crowded piazzas, and the air seemed heavy with the scent of faith itself. For centuries, Rome had been the center of holiness, the seat of Saint Jane, Peter, and the beating spiritual core of an entire civilization. But as dusk fell on this autumn night, another sound began to stir within the Vatican's towering walls. It was not the solemn chant of monks at prayer, nor the quiet murmur of scripture being read by candlelight. Instead, it was the clatter of goblets, the laughter of courtesans, and the faint strains of music that carried across the darkened courtyards. This was not the Rome of saints and martyrs, but of something far more earthly and infinitely more corrupt. At the center of it all sat a man who should have embodied the holiness of Christ on earth, the vicar of God, the shepherd of millions of souls. Yet his name would be remembered not for sermons or for salvation, but for corruption, lust, and sin that dripped from the gilded halls of the Vatican like wax from a dying candle. This man was Rodrigo Borgia, better known to history as Pope Alexander VI. Alexander was not the kind of pope imagined by the faithful. He was not cloaked in humility, nor bowed by the weight of divine duty. Instead, he sat like a king, draped in silks and jewels, his table heavy with gold, his lips stained with wine, and on this particular evening he was preparing to host what would become one of the most scandalous nights in the history of the Church. A night so infamous it would be whispered for centuries with equal parts horror and fascination. The Banquet of Chestnuts, a night when the Vatican became not a temple of God, but a stage for the most depraved spectacle Europe had ever known. To understand the gravity of this event, one must picture the scene as it unfolded. Beyond the Vatican's gates, the streets of Rome bustled with merchants, pilgrims, and beggars. To the common man, the Pope was a holy figure, a man whose very words carried the weight of heaven. Statues of saints loomed over marketplaces, frescoes of angels adorned chapel ceilings, and sermons thundered from pulpits warning of sin, damnation, and the fires of hell. The ordinary faithful could scarcely imagine what was about to take place within the very heart of their church. Inside, the Vatican's halls were alive with an entirely different kind of energy. Torches flickered against marble columns, casting long shadows that danced across frescoes of Christ and the apostles. But these holy images, meant to inspire reverence, looked down silently on preparations that mocked their very existence. Servants hurried to and fro, spreading silken cloths over banquet tables. Gold goblets were polished until they gleamed like firelight. Platters of roasted meat, exotic fruits, and spiced wines were arranged with a care that rivaled any royal feast. Yet the true entertainment for the night was not food, nor music, nor even political discussion. It was flesh. Dozens of courtesans, their beauty carefully chosen from the most luxurious brothels of Rome, arrived under the cover of night. Their gowns were sheer, clinging to their bodies in ways that left little to the imagination. Jewels sparkled at their throats, their laughter echoed through the papal apartments, and their perfume, heavy and intoxicating, lingered in the air like incense in a cathedral. These were not women of piety or prayer. They were here for one reason, to transform the Vatican into a playground of sin, and all of it was sanctioned by the Pope himself. This is where history and irony collide in brutal fashion. The papacy was meant to represent the pinnacle of Christian virtue, the living successor of St. Peter. Yet on this night, the head of the church presided over what can only be described as a sacrilege, dressed as a feast. The faithful outside prayed for salvation, while their supposed shepherd prepared to indulge in a spectacle of lust that would forever taint his name. The whispers began before the night even started. Rome was a city of secrets, and rumors traveled faster than sermons. Cardinals muttered in corners, merchants chuckled in wine shops, and courtiers smirked behind painted fans. Something scandalous was about to happen within the Vatican walls, something that would make even the jaded citizens of Renaissance Rome blush. And yet, for those invited, there was no shame, no hesitation. This was an era when power was measured in excess, when reputation was built not on virtue but on audacity. To be invited into the Pope's private chambers for such an event was not a disgrace, but an honor. For the noble families of Italy, for the ambitious courtiers seeking papal favor, This was a chance to be close to power and to indulge in pleasures forbidden to the masses. As the hour approached, guests arrived dressed in their finest silks, their faces flushed with both anticipation and wine. They passed through corridors guarded by papal soldiers, each step taking them deeper into the heart of a secret Rome hidden from the outside world. Finally, they entered the chamber where the banquet awaited. Long tables groaned under the weight of food and drink, and at the head sat Alexander VI, his eyes gleaming, his lips curling in satisfaction. The stage was set. The torches burned low. The chestnuts gleamed in their silver bowls, and history was about to record a night that no chronicler could write without trembling. But this was more than just a feast, more than just a scandal. It was a symbol, a living, breathing embodiment of everything the papacy had become under Alexander VI. Greed, lust, corruption, and indulgence were no longer sins to be condemned. They were luxuries to be celebrated. And the man meant to guard the gates of heaven was the very one leading his flock to damnation. The Banquet of Chestnuts was not an isolated event. It was the climax of years of corruption, the inevitable conclusion of a papacy built on bribery, lust, and ambition. Yet on this night, it would be stripped of all pretense. There would be no sermons, no scriptures, no prayers. Only laughter, flesh, and the reckless abandonment of everything sacred. As midnight drew near, the Vatican, the holiest site in Christendom, stood transformed. Outside, pilgrims prayed for salvation. Inside, courtesans laughed, nobles wagered, and the Pope himself prepared to preside not over a mass, but over an orgy. History often remembers kings and generals for their victories. But Alexander VI would be remembered for a single night of indulgence so obscene it would echo across centuries. The Banquet of Chestnuts was not just a scandal, it was a desecration, a moment when the seat of God became the stage for man's lowest desires. And as the torches flickered and the laughter grew louder, one truth became clear. This was not the house of God that night, it was the house of Borgia. To understand the scandalous night of the Banquet of Chestnuts, one must first understand the man who orchestrated it. For such corruption does not appear suddenly, like lightning out of a clear sky. It is nurtured, cultivated, and sharpened across years of ambition, indulgence, and cunning. Before he became Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia was already a man of appetites and calculation, molded by one of the most ruthless families in Europe, and driven by an ambition that would stop at nothing short of absolute power. Rodrigo was born in 1431 in the Spanish town of Zativa, near Valencia. At the time, Spain was not the mighty empire it would become under Ferdinand and Isabella. It was a patchwork of kingdoms, noble houses, and shifting loyalties. Into this world, the Borgia family carved its path. The Borgias were not known for humility or holiness. They were known for cunning, for ambition, and for their ability to bend any system, political, financial, or spiritual, to their will. From his earliest days, Rodrigo was immersed in a culture where survival meant manipulation, and power was the only true currency. His uncle, Alfonso de Borgia, rose to prominence within the church through his own mix of diplomacy and shrewdness. By 1455, Alfonso had ascended to the papacy as Pope Calixtus III, and Rodrigo, still a young man, suddenly found himself with a powerful patron in the most sacred office in Christendom. This was the moment that would change his life forever. Where other boys of his age studied scripture with trembling reverence, Rodrigo studied power. How it was gained, how it was wielded, and how it could transform even the son of a minor Spanish noble into the master of Rome. Calixtus wasted no time in elevating his nephew. Rodrigo was sent to study law at the University of Bologna, where he quickly gained a reputation for intelligence, charm, and a charisma that drew others to him effortlessly. He was handsome, tall, broad-shouldered, with piercing eyes that seemed to see directly into the ambitions of those around him. But beneath that charm lay a hunger. Rodrigo was not content to be merely a scholar or a priest. He wanted more, much more. In 1456, barely in his mid-20s, Rodrigo was appointed a cardinal by his uncle. Soon after, he was made vice-chancellor of the church, one of the most powerful administrative positions in the entire Vatican. Imagine that, a young man, barely out of his studies, suddenly seated at the very table where the wealth and influence of Christendom flowed. It was a position of unimaginable opportunity, and Rodrigo seized it with both hands. From that moment forward, the Vatican was not just a holy institution for Rodrigo. It was his playground, his training ground, his battlefield. He mastered the art of political intrigue, negotiating with kings, cardinals, and ambassadors. He learned how to move pawns on the board of power without ever exposing his own hand. And above all, he learned that in the Church of the Renaissance, holiness was often just a mask for ambition. Rodrigo did not wear the robes of chastity as others might. Even as a young cardinal, he was notorious for his relationships with women. Chronicles tell us of mistresses and lovers who bore him children, despite his sacred vows of celibacy. In an era when priests and popes alike often flouted their vows, Rodrigo distinguished himself not by restraint, but by excess. He did not hide his indiscretions, he flaunted them, and Rome, cynical and corrupt, scarcely blinked. We must remember the context. The Renaissance was a time of splendor and sin, of soaring cathedrals and brutal wars, of genius artists and ruthless politicians. The Vatican itself was less a sanctuary of prayer than a stage for power. Simony, the buying and selling of church offices, was common. Nepotism was rampant. Wealth flowed in through indulgences, donations, and political bribes. Rodrigo was not alone in exploiting the system, but he was unmatched in how effectively he bent it to his will. By the time his uncle Calixtus III died in 1458, Rodrigo had already secured his position. Other popes came and went, but Rodrigo remained vice-chancellor for over 3 decades, outlasting rivals, surviving political storms, and enriching himself at every opportunity. He became known as a master administrator, a man who could turn chaos into order, who knew every detail of the church's finances and every weakness of its politics. Behind closed doors, however, he became equally known for his appetite, for women, for wealth, and for power. The stories from this period are almost too scandalous to believe. Banquets where Rodrigo surrounded himself with courtesans, secret children born from his affairs, whispered rumors that no vow, no moral law, no sacred promise could restrain him. And yet, far from destroying him, these stories seemed only to increase his allure. In a city where everyone sinned, Rodrigo sinned better. He sinned with style, with confidence, and with a brazenness that made others admire even as they condemned. By the 1470s, Rodrigo had fathered multiple children, among them Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, who would later become infamous in their own right. He secured lavish estates for his lovers, arranged marriages for his offspring, and built networks of loyalty that would serve him for decades. He was not just a churchman, he was the head of a dynasty, a man weaving a web of influence that stretched across Italy and Spain. And yet, despite his growing infamy, Rodrigo maintained his iron grip on the Vatican bureaucracy. His charm and intelligence made him indispensable. He could negotiate with monarchs, smooth over disputes among rival factions, and administer the vast machinery of the church with ruthless efficiency. Popes came to rely on him, even as they whispered about his corruption. His sins were tolerated because his skills were unmatched. But beneath this careful balance of sin and skill, Rodrigo nurtured a single dream, the papacy itself. He had seen how his uncle's brief reign had elevated the Borgia name. He knew that if he could one day claim the throne of St. Peter, the world itself would bow to him. Every decision he made, every alliance he built, every risk he took was aimed at one goal: the tiara, the keys of heaven, the power to rule not just Rome, but Christendom itself. By the end of the 15th century, Rodrigo Borgia was no longer just a cardinal. He was a force of nature, a man both feared and admired, loathed and envied. His appetites were whispered in every alley of Rome, his brilliance acknowledged in every palace. He was the embodiment of Renaissance corruption, but also of Renaissance power. And so, when the papal throne fell vacant in 1492, Rodrigo saw his moment. A lifetime of ambition, indulgence, and cunning had brought him here. He would not let it slip away. The boy from Spain, born into a family of ambition and scandal, was ready to seize the most sacred office in the world. And in doing so, he would drag the papacy itself into an age of corruption so deep it would echo for centuries. Rodrigo Borgia was about to become Pope Alexander VI, and the world, though it did not yet know it, was about to witness one of the most corrupt reigns in the history of the Church. In the summer of 1492, Rome stood at a crossroads. The city was swollen with pilgrims, merchants, and nobles, each one whispering of the same question: who would wear the fisherman's ring next? Pope Innocent VIII was dead, and with his passing, the throne of Saint Number Sane, Peter, lay vacant. For the faithful, this was a sacred moment, a time to pray for divine guidance as the College of Cardinals gathered to elect a successor. But for Rodrigo Borgia, this was not a holy moment. It was an opportunity, the opportunity he had waited for his entire life. For more than 30 years, Rodrigo had ruled as vice-chancellor of the Church. He knew its accounts better than any man alive. He knew which cardinals were greedy, which were vain, which longed for favors, and which could be bought with gold, land, or women. Where others saw a conclave, Rodrigo saw a marketplace. And he came prepared to buy. The papal election of 1492 was one of the most notorious in history. The cardinals gathered in the Sistine Chapel, a place where the ceiling still bore only stars, decades before Michelangelo would paint his masterpiece. Beneath those painted heavens, vows of secrecy and solemnity were exchanged. In theory, they were to pray for the Holy Spirit to guide their choice. In practice, whispers and bribes filled the air like incense. Rodrigo entered this arena armed with everything he had amassed in his decades of service: immense personal wealth, a network of alliances, and the ruthlessness of a man who had never known restraint. He knew he was not the holiest candidate. In fact, he was the least holy, but he was the most prepared. The chronicles tell us of a campaign that unfolded not with prayers, but with promises. Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, brother of the Duke of Milan, was one of the most influential figures in the college. To secure his support, Rodrigo promised him the lucrative office of vice-chancellor, the very position Rodrigo himself had held. Others were tempted with palaces, with estates, with titles of cardinal protector over wealthy cities. Still others received straight coin, heavy purses of gold that clinked as they passed from Rodrigo's agents into greedy hands. It was corruption on a breathtaking scale. Simony, the sin of buying spiritual office, had long plagued the Church, but never had it been practiced with such audacity. The election became a frenzy of bargaining, a carnival of bribery. Rodrigo's rivals watched in disbelief as he outmaneuvered them at every turn, offering more, promising more, delivering more. By the time the votes were cast, it was clear the papacy had been sold, and Rodrigo Borgia was the buyer. On August 11, 1492, Rodrigo was declared pope. The cardinals emerged from the conclave, their faces solemn, their voices echoing the sacred words, Habemus Papam, we have a pope. Outside, the people of Rome erupted in cheers, believing a man chosen by God had ascended the throne of St. Peter. They could not know the truth. They could not know that behind the holy ritual lay bags of gold, secret promises, and corruption so blatant that it mocked the very idea of divine will. Rodrigo Borgia took the name Alexander VI, invoking the memory of Alexander the Great. It was a name chosen not for humility, but for ambition. Like his namesake, Rodrigo sought empire, glory, and domination. He did not see the papacy as a burden of spiritual leadership. He saw it as the crown of Italy, the gateway to power, and the ultimate prize for a lifetime of scheming. The coronation was a spectacle of Renaissance splendor. Gold cloth hung from balconies, musicians filled the streets with triumphal fanfares, and nobles paraded in silks and jewels. Alexander himself was borne through the city on a gilded chair, carried high so all could see him. To the people it was a day of joy, a day of divine blessing. But to those who knew the truth, to the cardinals who had accepted his bribes, to the diplomats who had watched his maneuvers, it was a day of shame. The Church had been sold, and the price was the soul of Christendom. Yet Alexander showed no hesitation, no flicker of guilt. He wore the papal tiara not as a symbol of holy service, but as a crown of conquest. From the very first days of his reign, his actions made it clear: this would not be a papacy of prayer. This would be a papacy of the Borgias. Almost immediately he appointed his relatives to key positions, filling the Vatican with loyalists and sycophants. His son Cesare, though still young, was elevated to the rank of cardinal. Lucrezia, his daughter, became a pawn in political marriages, binding powerful families to the Borgia cause. Even his mistresses were rewarded, granted estates and honors that scandalized Rome. The papacy became a family enterprise, a dynasty disguised as a holy institution. What shocked many was not merely the corruption, but the brazenness of it. Previous popes had been corrupt, yes. They had taken bribes, fathered children, lived in luxury, but they had at least attempted the veil of secrecy, the pretense of holiness. Alexander did not bother with such masks. His ambition was naked, his indulgence shameless. Where others whispered their sins, he shouted them from marble balconies. The reaction was mixed. Some cardinals were horrified, fearing that Alexander's corruption would destroy the reputation of the Church. Others accepted it with cynical resignation. After all, had not the papacy been corrupt for generations? To many, Alexander was not a shock, but the logical conclusion of a system already rotten to the core. And yet, for all his sins, Alexander was also brilliant. His political maneuvers, his ability to charm and manipulate, his sheer force of personality made him formidable. Kings and princes courted his favor, ambassadors reported his every move. In a world where power was everything, Alexander VI was suddenly the most powerful man alive. But power came at a price. The whispers of his corruption spread quickly beyond Rome. Across Europe, rulers shook their heads at the spectacle of a papacy bought with bribes. Among the faithful, doubts began to grow. If the Pope himself could be so shameless, what did that mean for the Church? What did that mean for salvation itself? For now, Alexander basked in his triumph. The conclave of 1492 had given him everything he desired. He had climbed from the son of a Spanish family to the throne of Saint Peter. He had outwitted his rivals, silenced his critics, and bought the holiest office in Christendom. To his supporters, it was proof of his genius. To his enemies, it was the final proof of his corruption. But history has a way of judging not the triumphs of the moment, but the legacies that follow. And for Alexander VI, the legacy would be darker than any coronation, more infamous than any conclave. The Banquet of Chestnuts still lay in the future, waiting like a stain on the horizon. The world had seen how Rodrigo Borgia could buy a papacy. Soon, it would see how he would desecrate it. The papacy was never meant to be a throne of earthly indulgence. In the eyes of the faithful, it was the highest calling a man could receive, the mantle of St. Peter himself, the burden of guiding souls to salvation. But under Alexander VI, the papacy became something else entirely. It became a palace of pleasure, a fortress of the Borgia family, and the stage upon which lust and corruption were paraded without shame. From the very first months of his reign, Alexander made it clear that he would not govern as a monk or a shepherd, but as a king. The Vatican, which for centuries had echoed with prayers and hymns, now reverberated with laughter, music, and feasts. Gold poured into Rome, not for cathedrals or for the poor, but for spectacles, banquets, and the endless appetites of the Borgia dynasty. What shocked Rome most was not merely Alexander's greed, but his shamelessness. Previous popes had fathered children in secret, hiding their mistresses in villas and cloaking their indiscretions with silence. Alexander did not bother with secrecy. He openly acknowledged his children, elevating them to positions of wealth and power as though the papacy itself had become a family inheritance. Cesare Borgia, his ruthless and brilliant son, was made a cardinal at the age of just 18. Though still a youth, Cesare was already whispered about as a man of violent ambition, a mirror of his father's hunger for power. Lucrezia, his daughter, became a pawn in marriage alliances, passed from noble house to noble house as Alexander forged new ties across Italy, and behind them all stood Venosa dei Catane, Alexander's longtime mistress, whose relationship with the Pope was an open secret in the streets of Rome. This was not holiness. This was nepotism at its most brazen. The Pope was meant to serve God, yet Alexander VI served only his family. If family came first, wealth came a close second. Alexander treated the offices of the Church as commodities to be bought and sold. Cardinals who wished for influence found their path lined with bribes. Bishops' seats, abbeys, and even holy relics were auctioned to the highest bidder. Salvation itself became a currency under his reign, as indulgences, promises of forgiveness in exchange for money, were sold in increasing numbers to fill the papal coffers. The Vatican treasury swelled, but at a terrible cost. For ordinary Christians who sacrificed their last coins to buy indulgences or who watched corrupt bishops take office, faith began to erode. The Church no longer seemed like the house of God, but the marketplace of the Borgias. Yet Alexander's hunger was not only for money, but for pleasure. The Vatican became the site of endless banquets, festivals, and entertainments. Chronicles describe tables heavy with roasted meats, fountains of wine, and music that filled the night air until dawn. Courtesans, actors, and dancers mingled freely with cardinals and nobles, as the boundaries between the sacred and the profane dissolved completely. One chronicler wrote bitterly, "The Pope feasts like Caesar and sins like Caligula." The comparison was not accidental. Rome had once been the seat of the pagan empire, and under Alexander VI, it seemed as though the pagan gods had returned, clothed in Christian robes. Power was always at the center of Alexander's desires, and the Vatican became his fortress. He placed loyal Borgia relatives and allies in key positions, ensuring that no decision was made without his family's influence. Papal armies were commanded by Cesare, who was more warlord than churchman. Alliances were sealed with marriages arranged by Alexander for his children and nephews. To secure his dynasty further, Alexander arranged for his illegitimate son, Juan Borgia, to receive the title of Duke of Gandia. Juan's murder in 1497, likely the result of a family feud, revealed just how bloody the Borgia world had become. Rumors swirled that Cesare himself had ordered his brother's death. And yet, Alexander continued to protect Cesare, refusing to pursue justice, reinforcing the belief that the papacy itself had become a family's private kingdom, not God's house on earth. Perhaps nothing symbolized Alexander's corruption more vividly than his mistresses. Spinoza was only the beginning. Later, he took a new mistress, Julia Farnese, a young woman so beautiful she became known across Rome as Julia la Bella. Julia was not just a lover, she was paraded openly, her presence at papal events an affront to the vows Alexander had sworn. Artists even painted her likeness into religious frescoes, depicting her as the Virgin Mary, a scandal so outrageous that it shook the faithful to their core. Imagine the sight, pilgrims kneeling in prayer before images of Mary, unaware that the face they worshipped was that of the Pope's mistress. It was blasphemy disguised as devotion, and yet Alexander seemed to revel in the outrage it caused. Under Alexander VI, Rome itself became a city of contradictions. On the one hand, it flourished with Renaissance art and culture. Artists and architects were commissioned to create grand works, palaces were built, and the city glowed with splendor. On the other hand, crime, vice, and corruption festered in the shadows. Prostitutes lined the streets, mercenaries patrolled the alleys, and whispers of poisonings, assassinations, and conspiracies filled the night. The Pope was both feared and ridiculed. Feared for his power, his wealth, and his ruthless sons. Ridiculed for his excess, his lusts, and his shamelessness. The faithful prayed for salvation while their shepherd indulged in sins greater than any they could imagine. What made Alexander's papacy so catastrophic was not merely his personal corruption, but the precedent it set. When the Pope himself mocked chastity, who could take vows seriously? When the Pope himself sold indulgences, who could believe in forgiveness? When the Pope himself turned the Vatican into a brothel, who could see Rome as holy? Each act of corruption, each banquet, each mistress, each bribe chipped away at the foundation of faith. And though Alexander reveled in his power, the cracks he carved into the church would one day become fissures, splitting Christendom in half. All of this, the feasts, the mistresses, the nepotism, the corruption, built toward a climax. By 1501, Alexander had ruled for nearly a decade. His power was secure, his family entrenched, his appetites unchecked. It was in this context that the infamous Banquet of Chestnuts was born. It was not an accident, not a moment of weakness, but the inevitable conclusion of a papacy defined by indulgence. The feast would become the most notorious symbol of his reign, a night when the curtain was pulled back, and the world saw the Pope not as God's servant, but as man's most brazen sinner. To understand the reign of Pope Alexander VI, one cannot look only at the man himself. For though Rodrigo Borgia sat upon the papal throne, his papacy was never his alone. It was a dynasty, a web of blood and ambition woven through his children and kin. The Vatican under Alexander VI was not merely the center of Christendom, it became the headquarters of a family empire, a fortress of the Borgias. And with that empire came scandal after scandal, each one darker, bloodier, and more shocking than the last. At the heart of the family stood Cesare Borgia, Rodrigo's illegitimate son, elevated to the rank of cardinal while still a teenager. From the start, Cesare was no priest. He wore the robes of the church, yes, but his eyes were set on power and conquest. His ambition was feral, his will unyielding. Chroniclers describe him as handsome, athletic, and cold, with the charisma of a leader but the ruthlessness of a predator. Cesare used his father's papacy as a launching ground for his own empire. With Alexander's blessing, he abandoned his cardinalate and became a warlord, raising armies to carve out territory in central Italy. He ruled with iron and blood, assassinating rivals, intimidating nobles, and leaving behind a trail of corpses as he sought to build what many believed was to be the foundation of a new Borgia kingdom. His violence was legendary. Nobles who resisted him vanished in the night, their bodies dumped in the Tiber or left rotting in fields. Poisonings, stabbings, and sudden accidents became the trademarks of his campaigns. Rome itself whispered that Cesare was the very embodiment of Satan's cunning dressed in a nobleman's garb, and yet, to Alexander, Cesare was the favored son. The Pope overlooked his brutality, even shielded him from justice, because Cesare was the weapon through which the Borgias extended their reach. Where the father ruled with gold and seduction, the son ruled with steel and fear. If Cesare was the sword of the Borgias, Lucrezia was the mask. Beautiful, graceful, and intelligent, she was used again and again as a political pawn, married off to secure alliances with powerful Italian houses. But her name became synonymous with scandal, for wherever Lucrezia went, whispers followed. Rumors spread that she was her father's lover, her brother's accomplice, and the poisoner of her enemies. Tales of banquets where her golden hair gleamed under candlelight, while goblets of wine laced with deadly powder passed silently into the hands of rivals, filled the streets of Rome. Historians debate how much of this was truth and how much was slander. But in the eyes of the people, Lucrezia was no innocent bride. She was the enchantress of the Vatican, the femme fatale of Renaissance Rome, her very presence, a reminder that under Alexander VI, even daughters were not exempt from the family's games of lust and power. Together, the Borgias operated less like a holy household and more like a mafia clan. Each family member played a role. Alexander wielded the papacy, Cesare the sword, Lucrezia the allure, and other relatives were placed strategically across Italy. Cardinal positions, governorships, and titles were handed out like favors in a crime syndicate. Enemies of the Borgias did not live long. Rivals in Rome found themselves poisoned, often at feasts where they had been guests of honor. Nobles who opposed Cesare were hunted down on the battlefield. Even members of the family were not safe. When Juan Borgia, Alexander's other son, was murdered in 1497, all fingers pointed to Cesare. It was whispered that Cesare, jealous of his brother's favor, had orchestrated the killing himself. Alexander mourned publicly, but privately he protected Cesare, proving that even fratricide could not shatter the family bond of ambition. By the late 1490s, the Borgias' reputation was infamous across Europe. Rome itself groaned under their rule. Citizens watched as papal coffers were emptied into feasts, as mistresses were paraded through the streets, as noblemen disappeared in mysterious circumstances. The Vatican was no longer seen as the house of God, but as the palace of the Borgias. Foreign ambassadors wrote reports dripping with outrage. The papacy, they declared, had been turned into a family business of lust, greed, and murder. And yet no one dared openly challenge Alexander. His wealth, his political cunning, and Caesare's armies ensured that opposition was silenced swiftly and brutally. Yet some scandals were too loud to ignore. Tales of orgies held within the Vatican spread like wildfire. Accounts of cardinals joining feasts with courtesans, of Lucrezia acting as hostess at gatherings that blurred the line between banquet and brothel, stained the family's already infamous reputation. The most shocking of these tales, the Banquet of Chestnuts, would come in 1501. But even before that night, the Borgias were already symbols of excess. They were whispered to poison cardinals to seize their estates. They were said to have incestuous relationships within their own household. They were believed to kill without hesitation, all in pursuit of power. And what made it all the more terrifying was not the truth of these accusations, but the fact that so many of them seemed entirely believable. Through it all, Alexander VI remained at the center. He defended his children, rewarded their crimes, and used the papacy itself as the engine of their power. To him, the church was not sacred. It was a dynasty to be preserved, a crown to be passed down, not through the hands of the faithful, but through the blood of his children. The faithful outside Rome saw the papacy as their hope for salvation. But inside the Vatican, salvation was a currency to be bought and sold, and damnation was a tool for eliminating rivals. The scandals of the Borgia family were more than gossip. They were a reflection of a world where the line between sacred and profane had been obliterated. They showed how one family could twist the holiest institution of the Christian world into a theater for power, lust, and blood. And at the heart of it all, the Pope himself presided. Rodrigo Borgia, Alexander VI, had transformed the papacy into the Borgia Empire, and soon he would preside over the most infamous spectacle of them all, a night of lust, debauchery, and scandal that would forever brand his name with infamy. By the year 51, Pope Alexander VI had reigned for nearly a decade. In that time, he had turned the papacy into a throne for the Borgias, reshaped Rome into a city of spectacle and fear, and carved his family name into the annals of infamy. But all dynasties reach moments when the mask slips, when ambition and indulgence can no longer be contained in whispers and shadows. For Alexander, that moment came in the autumn of 51, when the Vatican prepared for what would become the most scandalous night in its history, the infamous Banquet of Chestnuts. Italy in 51 was not a nation but a chessboard of warring city-states. Milan, Venice, Florence, and Naples all competed for dominance, while foreign powers, France and Spain, looked hungrily across the Alps. The Pope was not merely a spiritual figure in this world. He was a kingmaker, a power broker, a ruler whose alliances could tip the balance of war. Alexander VI understood this better than anyone. His papacy was a constant dance of diplomacy and betrayal, sealed not with prayers, but with marriages, bribes, and secret deals. Cesare Borgia, his son, had been unleashed upon Italy like a storm, carving out lands through military campaigns, striking fear into noble houses, and binding the papacy to his conquests. Yet behind the politics, Rome itself simmered. Nobles whispered of murders and poisonings. Cardinals muttered about the Pope's shameless mistresses. Ordinary citizens shook their heads as indulgences were hawked like merchandise in the streets. The spiritual heart of Europe seemed less like the city of God and more like the stage of some pagan empire reborn. It was in this world of intrigue, decadence, and fear that Alexander conceived of a feast that would shock even Renaissance Rome, a feast that would flaunt everything his papacy represented: power, wealth, lust, and the deliberate blurring of the line between the sacred and the profane. The Vatican had seen banquets before, tables heavy with roasted meats, fountains flowing with wine, and halls filled with music were not unusual under Alexander VI. But this feast would be different. This was not a diplomatic banquet, nor a marriage celebration. It was a spectacle, carefully staged to dazzle allies, to bind courtiers with indulgence, and to leave no doubt about who held the power in Rome. Servants worked tirelessly for weeks. Tapestries were hung in papal apartments, depicting scenes of triumph and beauty. Candles were stockpiled in great quantities, so that the halls might glow like midday even under the cloak of night. Marble floors were polished until they gleamed, ready to reflect not just the flicker of torchlight, but the flesh of those who would soon crawl upon them. Tables were laden with delicacies, pheasants roasted with spices from the east, fruits imported at great cost from distant orchards, and wine strong enough to drown both reason and restraint. The Vatican kitchens prepared as though for royalty, and in a sense, they were, for Alexander and his Borgias considered themselves the true monarchs of Christendom. But the feast was not for all. The Banquet of Chestnuts was not an open celebration, but an exclusive gathering of the Pope's most loyal courtiers, cardinals, and noble allies. Each invitation carried with it both honor and danger. To be included was a sign of favor, proof that one stood close to the center of power. To refuse, however, was unthinkable. In Borgia Rome, absence could be taken as defiance, and defiance was often punished with poison. Whispers spread quickly through the city. The Pope was planning something extravagant, something unlike anything Rome had ever seen. Some said it would be a feast of unmatched luxury. Others murmured darker rumors, that it would be a night of debauchery, a performance of lust itself. The very anticipation became its own kind of theater. No scandalous feast could unfold without players. Rome's brothels, already infamous for their beauty and luxury, were quietly scoured for the finest courtesans. The women chosen were young, radiant, and skilled, not just in seduction but in performance. Their presence would transform the feast from banquet to spectacle. They arrived not in secrecy but with deliberate ceremony, escorted into the Vatican under the gaze of curious onlookers. Their silks were sheer, their jewels glittered in the torchlight, and their laughter echoed like a mocking hymn against the marble walls of the papal palace. For centuries, pilgrims had come to Rome seeking glimpses of saints and relics. Now, the city whispered, the Vatican would display something else entirely: flesh, desire, and the Pope's approval of sin. Rome was no stranger to rumor, but in those days leading up to the Banquet of Chestnuts, the city seemed to hold its breath. Merchants in the piazzas exchanged knowing glances. Cardinals who were not invited seethed in envy and disgust. Common citizens prayed for the church, even as they laughed at the absurdity of it all. Some chroniclers tell us that word of the coming feast spread so widely that people gathered outside Vatican walls on the night itself, straining their ears to hear the music, the laughter, the faint echoes of scandal carried on the night air. For though the Vatican was meant to be sacred ground, everyone in Rome knew it had become a theater, and every theater needs an audience. What was Alexander's purpose in all of this? Was it merely indulgence, a night to satisfy his endless appetite for pleasure? Or was it something more calculated? Some historians argue that the Banquet of Chestnuts was a political performance. By surrounding his cardinals and allies with excess, by indulging them in pleasures forbidden to ordinary men, Alexander bound them closer to him. They would leave the Vatican not just indebted, but compromised. Secrets were a currency in Rome, and those who partook in such a scandal could never oppose the Pope without risking their own exposure. Others suggest it was nothing more than lust made public, the inevitable climax of a papacy that had never known restraint. Alexander, they say, simply no longer cared. After a decade of feasts, mistresses, and scandals, the Pope of Rome had embraced corruption so fully that he flaunted it without shame. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps the Banquet of Chestnuts was both indulgence and strategy, a night of sin that doubled as a lesson in loyalty. Whatever the case, the stage was set. As October turned to November, the Vatican glittered with anticipation. The torches were lit, the musicians rehearsed, the courtesans prepared. Guests whispered nervously as they donned their silks, wondering what awaited them inside those marble halls. And above it all, Pope Alexander VI waited, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a man who had turned the holiest palace in Christendom into the stage for his family's theater of sin. The night was coming, the Banquet of Chestnuts, a feast that would sear itself into history as the most scandalous orgy ever hosted within the Vatican, was about to begin. On the evening of October 30, 1501, the Vatican glowed like a jewel in the darkness. Torches flickered against the marble walls, musicians tuned their instruments, and the halls of Christendom's holiest palace prepared to host a night that would forever stain its legacy. It would later be called Il Ballo delle Castagne, the Banquet of Chestnuts. But to those who witnessed it, it was something even darker, a night when the Vatican itself became a brothel, and the Pope of Rome presided not over a mass, but over an orgy. The feast was held in the Apostolic Palace, within chambers usually reserved for solemn gatherings of clergy and princes. That night, however, the atmosphere was transformed. Long tables were laid with silks and piled high with roasted meats, candied fruits, and goblets of rich wine. The scent of spiced pheasants and burning wax mingled with heavy perfumes that clung to the air. The marble floor had been polished until it gleamed, reflecting the torchlight in molten gold. At the head of the hall sat Pope Alexander VI himself, draped not in the humble robes of a shepherd, but in the silks of a king. His eyes glittered with indulgence, his lips curled into the smile of a man who believed nothing in heaven or earth could restrain him. At his side sat Cesare Borgia, the warlord's son, and Lucrezia, the daughter whose beauty had been used to bind noble houses. Together, they were the royal family of Rome, not the servants of God, but the rulers of a dynasty of sin. One by one, the guests entered, cardinals in crimson robes, nobles in velvet cloaks, courtiers perfumed and powdered. To be invited to such a feast was both an honor and a peril. Participation bound one closer to the Borgias, while refusal could mean ruin. And so they came, their laughter nervous, their their eyes darting between one another, wondering what spectacle awaited them. At first, it seemed a typical Borgia banquet. Musicians played lutes and flutes, servants poured wine, and plates were passed around with lavish generosity. Toasts were made to Alexander's health, to Caesare's conquests, to the glory of the church. Yet beneath the surface, tension rippled. Everyone knew this was no ordinary feast. Whispers had spread for weeks. Something darker was to come. At the Pope's signal, the doors opened once more. Into the hall swept 50 courtesans, dressed in gowns of sheer fabric that clung to their bodies, their jewels glinting in the torchlight. Their arrival silenced the room. These were not guests of honor, but performers in a spectacle that would soon unfold. The women laughed and swayed as they moved among the tables, pouring wine, brushing hands against the shoulders of nobles, leaning close enough for perfume and temptation to drown out reason. Rome had seen courtesans before, but never within the very walls of the Vatican, and never under the watchful gaze of the Pope himself. Then came the moment that would give the feast its infamous name. Large baskets of roasted chestnuts were brought into the hall and spilled across the polished marble floor. At another signal from Alexander, the courtesans disrobed, their silks falling away to reveal bare flesh glistening in the candlelight. Gasps and laughter rippled through the room. On hands and knees, the women crawled across the floor, collecting the scattered chestnuts as the Pope, his children, and the gathered guests looked on. Torches threw flickering shadows across the walls, making the scene appear both grotesque and surreal, a game of lust masquerading as entertainment, staged within the heart of Christendom. But the spectacle did not end there. Once the chestnuts had been gathered, the true purpose of the night began. The courtesans, now fully naked, paired with the nobles and cardinals present. Laughter gave way to gasps, and the hall of the Apostolic Palace transformed into a theater of flesh. Contemporary chroniclers tell us that the Pope himself presided over the debauchery like a master of ceremonies, rewarding participants with prizes, fine silks, gold coins, and jewels, for those who performed with the greatest vigor. Cesare is said to have joined with the same ruthless intensity he brought to the battlefield, while Lucrezia, scandalously, acted as hostess, ensuring the courtesans and their partners were well supplied with wine and encouragement. It was a carnival of lust, a blasphemous reversal of the sacred rituals the Vatican was meant to uphold. Where once the floor had echoed with hymns, now it was filled with moans and laughter. Where once candles had lit solemn prayers, now they illuminated acts that even pagan emperors might have hesitated to sanction. Perhaps most shocking was not the act itself, but the participation of the Church's highest figures. Cardinals, men sworn to celibacy, indulged openly. Nobles who claimed to defend the faith reveled without restraint. And through it all, Pope Alexander VI looked on, smiling, as though he were hosting not an orgy, but a sermon. The message was clear. In Borgia Rome, nothing was sacred. Not vows, not holiness, not the papacy itself. Power meant indulgence, and indulgence meant submission. Those who joined the feast were bound by its scandal forever, their complicity a chain tying them to Alexander's will. The Banquet of Chestnuts was more than debauchery. It was theater. Every detail carried meaning. The naked courtesans crawling for chestnuts symbolized the submission of virtue to vice, the degradation of what should be holy. The prizes handed out by the Pope symbolized the corruption of the Church, where rewards were given not for holiness, but for sin. It was not merely indulgence. It was a demonstration of power, a performance meant to remind everyone present that Alexander VI could desecrate the holiest palace in Christendom and no one could stop him. As the hours wore on, the orgy blurred into chaos. Wine flowed until reason drowned, flesh mingled until names no longer mattered, musicians played until their fingers ached, and the laughter of the Pope echoed long into the night. Outside, Rome slept uneasily, unaware of the full scope of what transpired within the Vatican walls. For those inside, the feast ended not with solemn blessings, but with exhaustion, scandal, and silence. Guests stumbled home in the early hours, their silk robes stained with wine, their reputations forever tainted. And within the Apostolic Palace, the Pope of Rome reclined, satisfied that he had presided over the most infamous night in the history of the Church. The Banquet of Chestnuts would be remembered for centuries, its details recorded by chroniclers who could scarcely believe what they had witnessed. Some accounts may have exaggerated, others softened, but the essence remained undeniable. The Pope of Rome had turned the Vatican into a brothel, and the world would never forget it. What had begun as whispers of scandal became a legend of corruption, a symbol of everything rotten in the late medieval church. It was proof for many that the papacy had fallen so far from holiness that only fire and reform could cleanse it. When the torches finally burned low in the Apostolic Palace and the last of the courtesans departed into the dawn mist, the Vatican lay silent. But silence in Rome was never true silence. In the stillness of morning, whispers had already begun to stir, whispers that would swell into roars of outrage and scandal across the eternal city. The Banquet of Chestnuts was over, but its consequences were only beginning. At first, only those present knew the full truth. Cardinals stumbled back to their villas, their crimson robes stained with wine and shame. Courtiers slipped into the night, their faces flushed with exhaustion and fear. But secrets of such magnitude do not remain secrets for long. Servants had seen, musicians had played, guards had watched, and they carried tales into the taverns, the piazzas, and the markets of Rome. By midday, the city was alive with rumor. Merchants trading near Campo de Fiori whispered of courtesans crawling for chestnuts on the Vatican floor. Housewives gathering water spoke of cardinals abandoning vows for prizes of gold and silk. Children ran through alleyways chanting crude rhymes about the Pope's feast. Within a day, the spectacle had transformed from rumor to legend, exaggerated with each retelling until Rome itself seemed to groan under the weight of its own disbelief. For ordinary Christians, the scandal was more than gossip. It was a wound. The Pope was the vicar of Christ, the shepherd of souls. Yet the story spreading through Rome told of a man who presided not over Mass but over debauchery, not over prayers but over orgies. Pilgrims who had traveled from distant lands to kneel before holy relics now looked upon Saint Seine. Peter's with suspicion. Was this truly the center of Christendom? Or had the gates of hell opened within its walls? Many refused to believe the rumors, clinging desperately to faith. Others believed too quickly, their outrage boiling into bitterness. Priests in local parishes found themselves forced to defend a church that seemed indefensible. How could salvation be preached from pulpits when the throne of Peter itself was smeared with scandal? Perhaps most trapped of all were the cardinals and nobles who had attended. Their shame was their prison. To denounce the feast was to condemn themselves, for they had participated. To speak openly was to risk exposure, ridicule, and ruin. And so, silence became their refuge. This silence, however, was precisely what Alexander VI desired, for those who had surrendered themselves at the Banquet of Chestnuts were now bound to him not merely by loyalty but by guilt. They could not oppose him without dragging their own reputations into the mire. The orgy had been more than indulgence, it had been a calculated act of domination. Yet not everyone was silent. Outside the Borgia circle, rivals sharpened their knives. Enemies of Cesare whispered to foreign ambassadors. Critics of Alexander murmured to reformist preachers. Each new account of the banquet became ammunition in a war not of swords, but of reputations. In Florence, the followers of the recently executed preacher, Savonarola, seized upon the scandal as proof of what the friar had long proclaimed, that Rome had become the new Babylon, a city of sin awaiting divine fire. In Northern Europe, travelers carried tales of the feast back to their homelands, where murmurs of disgust would later fuel calls for reform. The Pope's excesses, once dismissed as rumor, were now undeniable. And though Alexander himself brushed aside the scandal, the reputation of the papacy was blackened beyond repair. For the common people of Rome, scandal was not new. They had lived for years under the shadow of Borgia corruption. They had seen mistresses paraded openly, cardinals poisoned mysteriously, and the Pope's children elevated like royalty. Yet the Banquet of Chestnuts was different. It was not merely corruption. It was desecration. Even those hardened by cynicism shook their heads at the brazenness of it all. A feast of naked courtesans crawling for chestnuts upon Vatican marble? Cardinals competing for prizes of sin in the presence of the Pope himself? It was too much. Some mocked openly, penning satirical verses and crude sketches. Others fell silent, their faith shaken, their devotion hollowed. The streets of Rome rang not with rebellion but with disillusionment. And in some ways, this was worse. Outrage burns hot and fades. But disillusionment lingers, seeping into the foundations of belief until even the devout begin to question. Alexander VI, however, seemed unbothered. He did not issue denials or apologies. He did not discipline the cardinals or dismiss the servants who had spoken. To him, the scandal was simply another rumor in a city already swollen with intrigue. He had survived worse, and he knew that in Rome, memory was short when gold and power flowed freely. But even his indifference was telling. For where other leaders might have sought to conceal their sins, Alexander wore his as armor. By refusing to acknowledge guilt, he made it clear that he did not fear consequence. And in that brazen confidence lay both his strength and his doom. The Banquet of Chestnuts did more than scandalize Rome. It deepened the cracks already spreading through the foundation of Christendom. Reformist voices grew louder, their calls for cleansing the church given new urgency by tales of Vatican orgies. Monarchs across Europe shook their heads in private, disgusted yet cautious, unwilling to risk open conflict with a pope still powerful. But beneath the surface, trust was breaking. Faith in the papacy as the moral compass of Christendom was eroding. And when faith in the shepherd falters, the flock begins to scatter. In time, the Banquet of Chestnuts became more than an event. It became a symbol of a church that had lost its way, a papacy that had traded holiness for indulgence, a dynasty that had mocked the sacred for the sake of its own appetite. Even centuries later, reformers, historians, and preachers would invoke that night as evidence of the rot at Rome's heart. For Alexander VI, the scandal faded into the long list of sins that defined his reign. But for the world, it became a turning point. Proof that corruption had reached heights so grotesque that something had to change. In the end, the aftermath of the Banquet of Chestnuts was not riots or revolutions. It was whispers. Whispers that eroded faith, that armed enemies, that spread across Europe like smoke from a smoldering fire. Whispers that told every man, woman, and child that the holiest palace in Christendom had become the stage for sin. And though Alexander VI continued to reign, though Cesare continued to conquer, though Lucrezia continued to marry and charm, the shadow of that night never lifted. It clung to the Vatican, to Rome, to the papacy itself. The Banquet of Chestnuts was not merely a feast. It was a scar on the soul of Christendom that would not heal, a reminder that when corruption is flaunted openly, faith itself begins to crumble. The orgy ended. The torches burned out. The chestnuts rotted away, but the stain of Pope Alexander VI's reign did not vanish with the dawn of November 1501. Instead, it deepened, spreading like ink across parchment, soaking through the very fabric of Christendom. The consequences of his corruption were not measured in days or weeks. They were measured in generations. In the years immediately following the Banquet of Chestnuts, Alexander continued his reign much as before. His court remained lavish, his family powerful, his policies ruthless, yet his name was now synonymous with infamy. Even in his lifetime, he was whispered about as the most corrupt pope in history. Foreign ambassadors recorded their disgust in letters home. Venetian envoys described Rome as a brothel under papal license. German observers muttered that if this was the shepherd of souls, then surely the flock was doomed. Kings who once sought Alexander's favor began to treat him with wary distance, unwilling to openly challenge his authority, but loath to honor him as a spiritual guide. The damage was not confined to politics. Among ordinary Christians, trust in the papacy was crumbling. For centuries, the Pope had been seen as the rock upon which faith was anchored. But Alexander's reign made the unthinkable thinkable, that the Pope himself could be the greatest sinner of all. This erosion of trust planted seeds that would not fully bloom until after Alexander's death. Across northern Europe, reformist preachers used stories of Borgia corruption to rally support for cleansing the church. Every whispered detail of the Banquet of Chestnuts, every tale of Cesare's brutality or Lucrezia's scandals became fuel for sermons about Rome's decadence. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg in 1517, just 15 years after Alexander's death, he was striking against indulgences, the very practice Alexander had perfected and exploited. The cries for reform that shook Europe did not begin with Luther alone. They had been building for decades, and the reign of Alexander VI was one of the heaviest stones placed upon the scale of discontent. To many reformers, Alexander became the embodiment of all that was wrong with the papacy. His name was invoked not merely as a man, but as a symbol. The Pope who turned the Vatican into a brothel, who sold salvation for coin, who mocked holiness with debauchery. In him, they saw the proof that the Church needed not just reform, but rebirth. For all his efforts to build a lasting dynasty, Alexander's corruption ultimately destroyed the very legacy he sought to preserve. His beloved son Cesare, once feared as a ruthless warlord, fell from power after Alexander's death in 1503. Betrayed by allies, hunted by enemies, Cesare's empire collapsed, leaving him a fugitive until his death in battle a few years later. Lucrezia, long a pawn in her father's schemes, found stability only after Alexander was gone, marrying into the Este family of Ferrara and remaking herself as a respected duchess. But the scandals of her youth clung to her name, whispered in every court across Europe. The Borgia dream of a lasting dynasty, carved from the flesh of the papacy, dissolved in less than a generation. What remained was not power, but infamy. The cultural impact of Alexander's reign cannot be overstated. Preachers and poets alike compared Rome under the Borgias to ancient Babylon, the city of sin destroyed by divine wrath. Artists painted scenes of decadence with subtle references to the Vatican. Writers told allegories of corrupt shepherds who led their flocks into damnation. Even centuries later, Protestant reformers and Catholic critics alike invoked Alexander VI as the ultimate warning of what happens when the Church weds itself to power and lust. His name became shorthand for papal corruption, the kind of moral rot that demanded reform or ruin. Every pope who came after Alexander labored under his shadow. Julius II, the warrior pope, sought to restore the Church's reputation through strength and grandeur. Leo X, a Medici, embraced culture and art but could never fully erase the lingering stench of Borgia scandal. When Luther rose, the memory of Alexander's excesses gave his words sharper teeth. Even within the Catholic Church itself, Alexander became a ghost. He was remembered not for doctrine or theology, not for reforms or councils, but for sin. Few papal reigns are so thoroughly defined by vice, but in Alexander's case, it was impossible to separate the man from the corruption. And yet, there is a strange irony in Alexander's story. For though he is remembered as the most corrupt pope in history, he also ensured the survival of the papacy through some of its darkest hours. His political cunning, his ruthless defense of papal authority, his alliances with powerful families, all of these stabilized Rome in an era of chaos. Without him, some argue, the papacy itself might have crumbled under foreign invasion or Italian civil war. But this survival came at a terrible cost, the loss of spiritual legitimacy. Alexander preserved the body of the papacy while poisoning its soul. He ensured the Vatican's walls stood tall, but within those walls, faith decayed. Through the centuries, historians have wrestled with Alexander's legacy. Was he a monster of lust and greed? A shrewd politician undone by his appetites? A symbol of Renaissance excess? Or all of these at once? Most agree on one point: his reign represents the nadir of papal morality. The Banquet of Chestnuts, whether exaggerated or not, remains one of the most infamous events in church history. His nepotism, his indulgences, his mistresses, his shamelessness, these were not isolated sins, but a pattern. A pattern that weakened the moral authority of the Church at precisely the moment it needed strength most. Ultimately, the long-term impact of Alexander VI's corruption lies not only in history, but in memory. His story has endured for over 5 centuries because it speaks to a truth deeper than one man's sins. It is a reminder that power without restraint corrupts absolutely, that institutions, no matter how holy, can rot from within if led by men who worship themselves more than their God. For the faithful of his time, Alexander's reign was a tragedy. For reformers, it was a rallying cry. For history, it is a warning that echoes still. The Banquet of Chestnuts ended in a single night, but the shadow of Alexander VI stretched across generations, shaping the course of Christendom itself. His lust and corruption helped light the fire of Reformation, a fire that would burn Europe for centuries. And his name remains, even today, a byword for infamy. The Pope who sold his soul and dragged the Church with him into disgrace. The story of Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, does not end with his death in 1503. His body may have been lowered into the ground, his dynasty scattered by betrayal and war, but his shadow has never left history. For centuries, his name has been invoked as a symbol of corruption, of lust, of ambition unchained. He was the Pope who turned the Vatican into a palace of sin, the father who placed dynasty above divinity, the man whose scandals became scars on the soul of Christendom. But to end the story here, with only condemnation, would be too simple. For the true legacy of Alexander VI lies not only in his infamy, but in what his reign revealed about power, corruption, and human nature itself. His papacy is a mirror in which every age sees its own reflection. Alexander's reign demonstrates the terrible price of corruption when it sits upon the highest throne. The papacy was meant to be the guardian of souls, the defender of the weak, the shepherd of Christendom. Yet under Alexander it became a family business, a theater of indulgence, a fortress of the Borgias. This corruption weakened not only Rome, but the entire Christian world. Faith in the papacy eroded, cynicism spread, and reformers found proof for their accusations. The Banquet of Chestnuts became more than scandal. It became a metaphor. A pope presiding over orgy and debauchery symbolized a church so poisoned that even its holiest offices had been dragged into sin. The lesson is timeless. When leaders use power for self-indulgence rather than service, institutions decay, trust crumbles. The very foundations of faith and order collapse. The Banquet of Chestnuts lasted one night, yet its memory endures 500 years later. Why? Because symbols are stronger than events. What mattered was not only what happened, but what it meant. Naked courtesans crawling for chestnuts upon Vatican marble. This image seared itself into the imagination of Europe. Whether every detail was true or exaggerated no longer mattered. The symbol had taken root. It stood for everything corrupt, everything decadent, everything wrong with the papacy of the Renaissance. History often moves not by battles or treaties, but by symbols. And Alexander VI became one of the most powerful symbols of all, proof that even the holiest man on earth could fall into the darkest sin. Perhaps the most disturbing lesson of Alexander's reign is the fragility of institutions. The Church of Rome had stood for over 1,000 years, claiming divine guidance, boasting unbroken succession from St. Peter. And yet, one man's lust and ambition could twist it into something unrecognizable. This is not only a story of religion, it is a story of all institutions. Governments, companies, kingdoms, all are fragile when leaders place themselves above their duty. The Vatican was supposed to be unshakable. Alexander proved it could be shaken from within. And yet, even in corruption, there is paradox. For though Alexander sought to crush holiness with indulgence, his excesses gave birth to reform. His corruption outraged, inspired, and awakened generations to demand change. It is one of history's ironies that the man who most desecrated the Church also helped set the stage for its renewal. Luther's Reformation, the Council of Trent, the reshaping of Catholicism in the centuries to come, all were fueled, in part, by the outrage that men like Alexander had caused. From this we see a deeper truth. Corruption can wound, but it can also awaken. Darkness can give rise to light. The human spirit, when confronted with depravity, often finds strength to resist. Why does Alexander VI matter in our modern world? Why should we care about a pope who died 5 centuries ago? Because his story is not just about the Renaissance. It is about power and its dangers. We live still in a world where leaders fall prey to greed, where dynasties place family above duty, where symbols of corruption can shatter trust in entire institutions. The Banquet of Chestnuts may belong to history, but its lesson belongs to us. We must remember that corruption is never contained, it spreads. When the shepherd sins openly, the flock scatters. When leaders indulge without shame, the people beneath them lose faith not only in men, but in the systems that govern them. It is easy to imagine Alexander as a caricature, a lecherous pope feasting in candlelit orgies. But he was more complex. He was intelligent, cunning, politically skilled. He preserved the papacy as an institution even as he poisoned its soul. He was both protector and destroyer, both survivor and sinner. This complexity is why his story endures. He was not a monster inhuman in nature. He was human, too human. His vices were the same as those that tempt all men: lust, greed, ambition. The difference was only scale. Where most men fall quietly, Alexander fell from the highest throne in Christendom, and so his sins shook the world. In the end, history remembers Alexander VI, not for theology, not for governance, not for spiritual guidance. It remembers him for scandal. He may have believed himself immortal through his dynasty, but his immortality came in a different form, as a warning. The Banquet of Chestnuts is still told today not because it was the greatest feast, but because it was the greatest symbol of corruption. His name lives on, not in reverence, but in infamy. And perhaps that is its own kind of justice. As we close the story of Alexander VI, we return to that image, chestnuts scattered across marble, courtesans crawling as the Pope looks on. It is grotesque, obscene, unforgettable. It is also symbolic. It tells us that power without restraint reduces dignity to spectacle, that lust without shame consumes holiness, that corruption without consequence can hollow even the greatest institutions. But it also tells us something else, that history watches, that no sin, however secret in its time, remains hidden forever, that actions echo through generations, shaping worlds in ways the sinner never imagined. Alexander VI sought pleasure, but he left a legacy. Not the legacy he intended, but the legacy he deserved, a warning for all ages.